Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. We move on to our second Unbroken Bonds deck so far, this time looking at Gardevoir&Sylveon Tag Team, a very potentially powerful and disruptive archetype coming out from the new set, which I think has bags of potential and has recently been doing well in Japan. Let's go over the basic concept. Essentially, the GX attack is the thing that we're building this archetype around. We're trying to work towards the big Tag Team GX attack that does for 6 Fairy Energy on one of your Gardevoirs, 200 damage to the active, and also forces your opponent to shuffle their entire hand back into their deck and leave them with nothing. That's the entire basis of the archetype. We will steal the tempo of the game by giving your opponent no playable cards in their hand, put them in top deck mode, sometimes they draw nothing, and with those blank turns, especially if we're taking a knockout at the time with that 200 damage baseline, we're going to leave them with no real attacker in play, well, hopefully, and leave them essentially passing. And when they're passing against us, we can continue to use things like Kaleidostorm to get over the line when they have turns of really just not doing much. That's the whole concept of this archetype. And because we have 260 hit points as a baseline, we have choice helmets in here, and we have an attack for just 1 energy, which attaches more to our other Gardevoirs in the bench. We really are lending towards an Acerola style approach. We're going to, in the early turns, just be building up our energy cards, Acerolaing from one Guardy to the next while we build up energy all across the board. Kaleidostorm moves energy all around with Gardevoir as well, so it's all very flexible with this deck, and that seems to be one of the big things here, because whenever one Guardy gets hit, we're normally Kaleidostorming an amount of energy off of her, so that if we can take hits, we can Acerola back up. That's the whole idea here. So trying to undo a lot of damage being done to us whilst building energies the entire time towards this massive GX attack turn. Onto the Pokemon, and it's going to be another one of these quad-based builds where Gardevoir/Sylveon is going to be the entire basis of the deck. 4 copies of her, as I mentioned, 260 baseline hit points, Fairy type, weak to metal. That Fairy Song allows you to search your deck for 2 Fairy and attach them to your benched Pokemon in any way that you like. And that means you can be powering up 2 onto 1 or 1 onto 2 different Gardevoir/Sylveons on your bench. You can do exactly how you want to do it. We can move into Kaleidostorm, which has for 2 Fairy and a colorless 150 damage, and move any number of energy from your Pokemon to your other Pokemon in any way that you like. Again, so both these attacks are however you want to do it. You can start going aggressive and stacking a bunch of energies all onto one Gardevoir if you want to. Fairy Song once, and then Kaleidostorm into like your next Gardevoir, all 3 back to the bench, or you can just move 1 off the active, you can move 2 off the active. It's all up to you, really, in terms of what you're anticipating your opponent to do in response to you. And then we have that Magical Miracle GX attack. 200 damage just for the 3 Fairy, but we are almost always trying to get the 3 extra Fairies on board to force your opponent to shuffle. The only time you don't get more than 3 energies into play is when you're up against the lightning stuff, because they have the potential to Tapu Koko GX. And that is far too scary to allow. So essentially against the Zapdos players and against Pikarom players, you only ever keep 3 or 4 energies in play at any one time. And you just Kaleidostorm around and try and use Acerola when you can. That's pretty much the intention. Against everything else, build up your energy cards and go for that Magical Miracle turn. I'm going for a 2-2 line of Mismagius, and I owe Mismagius an apology. I rated it very poorly in the set review, and I'm seeing more reasons to potentially add it into different decks. One thing I did miss about the Mismagius, which is actually very relevant, is that you can knock it out from the active position. So essentially, Misdreavous isn't a bad lead for you in the deck, because you can find a Dusk Stone, evolve up in 1 turn, knock out the Mismagius, and then you can promote yourself a Gardevoir, which is already a very good thing, which I had forgotten or not really noticed in the first instance. And also the fact, of course, is that we're just tag teams, so allowing Mismagius to get knocked out 2 times has no downside to us, and it actually leads us towards being able to play a couple cool cards like Countercatcher, so that we can use a green search-based engine. So the Mismagius, the downside, quote-unquote, is pretty much mitigated when you're playing a quad-style deck. Initially, I thought I was going to be playing Rabombe. I've thought about building both lists, and I'm sure I will be doing a Gardevoir list with Rabombe soon as well. But the initial thought, I think, is that Mismagius might be the stronger option, just because then we get to take full advantage of green search. So right now, Mismagius is my favorite option, because you get to play green search. That's the biggest deal here. It's really that you're playing quad Gardevoir/Sylveon, basically. But this Magius is an extra enabler that lets you draw a few more cards here and there for no real downside, so that's the main intention. For the prize trade, it won't have any effect, and this is effectively a free retreater because as soon as you evolve, you get out of the active anyway by knocking yourself out. So it feels like a nice 2-2 line that enables us to play some interesting item cards, mainly counter catches, the big one here, so that we can be Kaleidostorming big threats on your opponent's side of the field, whilst using Green Search to get ourselves other cards here and there. That's pretty much the intention. Onto the item cards, we're going to play one copy of Adventure Bag. It's one of these things that we can Green Search out, which can allow us multiple choice helmets all at once, or a choice helmet and choice band, which is pretty cool. Couple max potions, couple counter catchers. Both of these make Green Search incredible. Essentially, one Green Search supporter could be an Acerola and Guzma in the same effect. If we have used Mismagius to knock itself out a couple times, we can be behind in the game for a number of opening turns, to be honest, to take full advantage of those counter catchers and deal with big threats on the opponent's side of the field. Energy Switch as a 2 count is really nice. Obviously, we have a lot of flexibility with how we attach our energies via Fairy Song and via Kaleidostorm, but E-Switch can also help us in those spots where maybe you need to panic Acerola, something you've been attaching a bunch to. You can E-Switch away from one of them to sort of save an energy before Acerolaing up, or before max potioning, for example. A couple copies of Switch. Obviously, we're trying to bounce between our Gardevoirs a lot. But if we haven't been hit into the active and we've used a Kaleidostorm, we can just switch into a new one that's been powered up on the bench. Couple Dusk Stone is the item card that allows us to evolve up into Mismagius straight away, which is a really nice deal for us. Obviously, again, Green Search can scout this out, so we don't need more than 2 copies in my opinion. 4 copies of PokeGear. I keep mentioning Green Search, but that is the crux of this deck. We are really reliant on her as the engine, so PokeGearing these out is going to be a big deal. We also have, of course, Mismagius for additional draws to try and find that. The 3 Nest Balls get us early Gardevoirs, which we need to attach to, of course, with our Fairy Song, and also Misdreavous if we need to. The tool cards I've already mentioned a lot, and the main reason why we're playing Choice Helmet over any of the Fairy Charms is that I'm anticipating Reshizard to be a very, very popular archetype, and the Fairy Charms don't help out against Reshizard. In fact, this deck just gets run over without Choice Helmet in the list, because Reshiram Charizard can just attach a Choice Band and one-shot you. Now Choice Helmet is trying to keep us out of range to give us a chance against the other top-tier archetype in the game right now for a tag team as well. Obviously, Pikarom is also very strong, and staying out of range of a couple Electro Powers is also very relevant. Force them to have an extra Choice Band, force them to have an extra Electro Power here and there. That's the whole idea. So a really high count of the helmets there. 3 copies of Power Plant as well. I think this is a very high count, but I think it's really important. Again, helping out against Zoroark, as well as helping out against Honchkrow. Obviously, if we can get it down before its ability, or if we can use like a counter catcher, then put our Stadium in, it could be really awkward for them, so that we can then attach Choice Helmets and whatnot whenever we need to. The idea here is, of course, that we can deny a Zoroark player. We can use our GX attack, whilst also putting the Power Plant down, so that they can't trade themselves out of a 1-card hand when they top deck for turn. That's pretty much the idea. So a very high count of Power Plant, but I really like establishing it and being a counter stadium in general. I could also see this just being a 2 count and buying yourself a space. This is, if anything, that one floating space. The 60th card in my list right now is the 3rd Power Plant, but I do think it's good to have early access to this as early as possible, because you're also stopping some turbo decks, like Turbo Pikarom using their Dedenes. You're trying to stop Persian GX getting value when you take knockouts on things. You're trying to do a lot, to be honest. So this Power Plant really is a big deal in my opinion. So the 3 count in my is pretty much where I'm at right now. Then 1 Wondrous Labyrinth Prism Star as well. This is another reason why I like having 3 of the Power Plants. Trying to win out the Stadium War and then drop a Wondrous Labyrinth late on. Again, it's one of these things that we can use when we are using our big GX attack to deny people from responding on us. They may have had backup attackers ready to go, maybe an attachment away or whatnot, or even if they're just fully powered up, we can put the Wondrous Labyrinth down and then suddenly they need to find another energy in order to respond on our Gardevoir. So it's a very awkward stadium to get around for a lot of different archetypes. Very, very nice Prism Star that we can take full advantage of in this list at last. On to supporter cards. It's a pretty interesting count, to be honest. The 4 of is the Green Search. That's the one we're going to try and use throughout the game as much as possible. Obviously, we have max potions, counter catchers, all the flexible like 2 ofs that we have in the deck for different situations, as well as just the ball search and the tools and whatnot. But then we also have a pretty high count of the Acerolas. Obviously, undoing that damage when we're using early Fairy Songs, and even after Kaleidostorms, it can be a huge deal. 3 copies of Erikas is more sort of supplementary. It can be a great draw for us. The reason why I like having Erika's in here is because we don't have any energy search. So Erika helping us get more energies manually attached is also very helpful. Because, of course, we're using Fairy Song a lot to get most of our energies, but it sort of becomes resource intensive on our own Acerolas. So I like having the Erikas in here as a backup. Bill's Analysis being a further backup to Green Search, essentially giving us 6 copies. Bill's obviously not being quite as effective, but still pretty useful. Especially after a couple of Fairy Songs, you've thinned your deck from a good amount of energy cards. Bills can get you into a good number of options. A couple of copies of Guzma to go alongside our double counter catcher. And then 2 copies of Judge. More hand disruption is nice in the mid game. Obviously, all we're trying to do is just Fairy Song, then Kaleidostorm, all that good stuff, until we reach our GX attack. So it's really not that resource intensive, our opening turns. And bear in mind as well, we also have Mismagius to fall back on, so we could play a Judge early on, then Mismagius to knock ourselves out to top our hand size back up. So we're trying to disrupt the opponent from early pressure, whilst also getting our own hand reloads. So it's a nice 2 count as well to follow on from the fact that we want to just deny the opponent options early on. It's really nice against these lightning decks that are going to try and accumulate electro powers against you. So I think it's a really big deal against Pikarom players to have a couple copies of Judge in here. Otherwise, they'll bide their time to reach 1-hit KOs, and that's going to be annoying for you. So I like the 2 count in this list. Finally, just 10 fairies. I think it's a reasonable number. It's plenty to Fairy Song out. Gives us a reasonable number to find in the early turns for just attaching manually. And I think in general, you're never going to really run out with 10. I've seen lists that play as low as 8. Sometimes there are lists that play 8 and a couple copies of Viridian Forest. You can go down that route if you really want to. Obviously, it can test the stadium more in a different way as well. So if you want to go down to 9 and drop the power plant, you can add in 2 forests, and I don't hate that at all. It's an option to explore as well. But for now, just 10 physical energy cards means that we're not worried about prizing any or whatever, and we have good odds to find it turn 1, which is something that we always want to do, so we can start firing off Fairy Songs as quickly as possible to spam our energies across the board. So here's the list in full. Another one of these decks that looks really strange on paper. Only 6 basic Pokemon and only 1 main attacker. It's the Gardevoir&Sylveon. Has a similar feel to Venusaur, where you have that massive amount of space committed to your engine. We have 42 spaces for the supporters, stadiums, trainers, and whatnot. So that's really huge, and it really does cater towards this deck because we can make a very specific combo happen a lot of the time, and that's the entire emphasis of this build. On to different tech options we could be playing. I did post a little question on Facebook the other day to see where most people were thinking about building Gardevoir, and it feels like this Rabombe is the most popular one by far from people. I think almost 100 people voted for this Rabombe to be the flagship sort of support Pokemon alongside the Gardevoir. Having that Mysterious Buzz ability is actually really huge. It stops people Guzmaing a lot of the time. I think we make up for the fact that people can Guzma the Gardevoir that we spam a bunch of energy onto all at once by having the amount of Acerolas that we do, the amount of E-switches that we can do as well, and the fact that Kaleidostorm's just so flexible that it doesn't really feel that big of a deal, even if they're gonna... Say, for example, we have like 4 energy attached to one of our Gardevoirs, and it gets Guzma'd up and hit for like 150 or something. We can just Kaleidostorm that away, and then that's the first Gardevoir that goes down, and then your opponent goes down to 1 prize because we've knocked out 2 of our own Mismagius, and we can just then Kaleidostorm to our next Gardevoir, and if they're then going to hit the Gardevoir that we've reattached to, we can just max push on the bench and do like Acerola plays, so we can really punish any sort of response of a Guzma as long as we're not getting knocked out. So I think the Rabombe is great because it enables you to play the Fairy Charms and you actually lock out a lot more archetypes. For example, if you play Rabombe, you're probably going to play Lightning Fairy Charm because it just locks up the Pikarom matchup much more than we currently do because we're just relying on Judge and hoping that they can't Stellar Wish into a number of E-Power all at once. So it feels a little bit shaky. Whereas the Rabombe can just say, lol, Fairy Charm to the active. Now you're really not doing much and Rabombe stops them from Guzmaing. The reason why we're not playing any Fairy Charms in this list, of course, is because we can't play enough Fairy Charms to attach to all of our Gardevoirs at once, and they can just Guzma around the other ones. So the idea is the Rabombe allows you to play more Fairy Charms, and that becomes very awkward. Speaking of Fairy Charms, there's a cute little combo that I think I'm going to be doing with Whimsicott, actually. It's using the Lele that has the Charmed Charm ability that confuses your opponent's active when you attach a Fairy Charm to it. and you use Magearna to pick that up and reuse it every single turn. It's again something I thought about alongside Rabombe, because the opponent can't Guzma any of your other tag teams when you're confusing them, which makes the confusion even more awkward because it forces them to actually pay retreat a lot of the time, which is really annoying for them. So I would have thought that there might be a way to play a Finn Fairy Charm package plus like a 1-1 count of Magearna, Fairy Lele, and the Rabombe. Of course, they can Guzma up the Magearna itself, but it's just a single prize and it won't affect them having to knock out 2 tag teams, similar to when you play Venusaur and you make them knock out like 2 Shamans and it doesn't affect the prize trade at all. So that's the idea there. Jirachi is another one that I think a lot of people are excited about as well. Obviously, we've seen how strong Stellar Wish is for a lot of different archetypes, and I can foresee it being useful as well, of course. I think the biggest payoff for me is I just think Green Search is so strong. Green Search is guaranteeing those pieces at the right times. Jirachi's digging for them a lot of the time, and it feels like, why dig when we can just guarantee a Green Search? That's my main question mark. Diantha's a supporter which you might consider. Obviously, when one Gardevoir goes down, that's your only window of opportunity to use a Diantha, but it can get back some key pieces. I think if you're playing like one-of copies of each of the Fairy Charms, and for example, your opponent plays a Blower and knocks out one of your Guardies, that's when Diantha seems amazing, because you can just Diantha back the Fairy Charm that was annoying them that whole time, attach it to your next one, and then you're walling them out of the game again. And then a nice non-GX attacking option might be the Xerneas Prism Star. You can use this if you feel like you need to have an attacker against some Hooper shenanigans. Right now, I'm again showing you the vanilla baseline that just can't answer Hooper what's it called? Ninetales. If you want to add in this Xerneas Prism to give yourself that response, you can definitely go for it. But as always, I like showing a nice vanilla baseline. The Xerneas Prism, of course, can get you around those awkward things, though, so add in the basic if you really want to. Overall, for the matchup overview, I think Blacephalon's really bad. The GX, because they can reach numbers, and they are very board-centric. Obviously, we can try and do Kaleidostorms plus our GX attack and maybe stop them having B-strings and whatnot, but they will oftentimes have a lot of Naganadel set up with a bunch of energy, and if they've had time to attach around the board, just using Bursting Burn each turn, or even just passing into the active to let us Fairy Song, doesn't matter too much for them, because they're just waiting for their chance to just go ahead and make big, mind-blown turns. The good news is Blacephalon GX is probably making way for the non-GX. Currently, we are actually very bad against Hooper Stall, because I'm not playing the Xerneas, so that should actually also be a bad matchup for you. But if we do play the Xerneas, it's actually very good for us. That's why I haven't called it a bad matchup, even though right now my 60 would actually fall to this. Porygon Z feels really bad because they can crazy code something like a Lucario Melmetal and start taking big one-shots. Obviously, we're not playing Weakness Policy in here. Don't think there's enough metal in the format for us to do that. But Porygon Z would also be very, very awkward. Reshizard also seems pretty awkward for us. Obviously, we are quite reliant on these choice helmets. But at the same time, they're still going to be putting a lot of pressure on us. And they have a lot of energy on board. If they can use a couple welders, even when they go down to a 0-card hand, they'll have Salazzle maybe. So they have like a good number of top decks that can get them back into a pretty healthy hand size. So I think Reshizard might be a little on the awkward side. And that's one of the reasons why I think Gardevoir will be kept in check a lot of the time. Also, side note, something that's not on this slide is Tool Drop is also an absolute auto loss for us. Because they're a non-GX metal type attacker that can one-shot us. So if Gardevoir&Sylveon does become popular, we have the instant counter deck in the form of Tool Drop if we really want to. For closing thoughts, I think there's definitely a few different ways that people are going to try and build Gardevoir. Honestly, it took me maybe like 3 hours to just theory through this list, start testing hands with both and seeing which one I preferred. The Rabombe is really cool. You have free retreat on the Cutifly, which has good benefits. And just denying people Guzmas means that you can take full advantage of the Fairy Charms. That's something that's very appealing, and I can definitely foresee there being 2 schools of thought behind this deck. Either you're playing the Rabombe, or you're playing the Mismagius. Those are the 2 I see being the most prevalent, to be honest. The main reason I like the Mismagius, again, it's all about Green Search. It's not really the Mismagius herself that helps the deck out. We're basically playing a quad Gardevoir-Sylveon. It's just... there is just some sense in playing the Mismagius because it gives us extra draw potential, and there's no real downside. It allows us to play Counter Catcher. That's pretty much the main reason why I like the Mismagius. It just lets us use Counter Catcher alongside Green. But yeah, there really isn't a big downside to playing Mismagius, which is pretty cool. Whereas Rabombe, obviously, it provides so much more for the deck in general. It's just our draw supporters are far worse. We have to PokeGear into Acerolas a lot more. We need to just hard draw into these things, which Green Search can guarantee for us, which is much more appealing in my book. But overall, that GX attack really is awkward, and not many decks can play around it. If you can set it up perfectly alongside, you know, either a Power Plant or a Wondrous Labyrinth, you can end up just sitting there, smacking with Kaleidostorm a couple more turns in a row, and then you've ended up winning the game because they've fallen 2 or 3 turns behind because they just have no hand to play with. That's pretty much the idea of this deck, and it is going to be powerful and strong in my opinion. Not many builds can completely prepare their board to be ready to have 0 hand for the next 2 or 3 turns. So that sounds awful and awkward to deal with. Let me know what you think about Gardevoir/Sylveon. Do you think it's going to be best with Rabombe? Do you think it's going to be best with Jirachi or Mismagius? I'll hear it all downside below. And yeah, we'll be moving on to our next Unbroken Bonds deck tomorrow. I think it's time for Reshizard to have its chance in the spotlight. I wanted to have a break from 2 fire decks in a row. That's why we've gone for Gardevoir today. Reshizard tomorrow, and then on to some more cool stuff. So hope you did enjoy, guys. Let me know what decks you want to see from Unbroken Bonds. And yeah, we'll be back tomorrow for another video. Cheers.